Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to today's SIG webinar. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules today to join us for the next hour. My name is Destiny Jewell, and I am the Director of Global Events here at SIG. I have the extreme pleasure of facilitating today's webinar entitled The Buck Starts Here, Building a Winning Business Case to Transform P2P, presented by our partners at Zycus. Today's webinar is meant to be interactive, so please submit your questions throughout the presentation by typing them into the Q&A box there on your WebEx screen. We will do our best to answer all questions at the conclusion of today's presentation, but do rest assured any that we do not get to, we will provide to the presenters, and they'll be happy to reach out to you after the webinar. Before I proceed, I do just have a few housekeeping and calendar items I'd like to review with you. Quickly, I'd just like to cover some of the resources that we provide here at SIG. Our global events. We'd love to have you attend one of our signature events or share them with your colleagues, of course. Please check out the SIG website frequently for upcoming cities and the current agenda in those cities. You do know about our webinar program, obviously, because you are attending a webinar today. Please visit our website frequently for an upcoming listing of those webinars and register for them. Please share those with your colleagues as well. Our SIG peer-to-peer resource is an opportunity for you to ask top-of-mind questions excuse me, for instant responses. These inquiries go out on Tuesdays and Wednesdays of every week, and you do not have to be a SIG member to respond. Our Resource Center is home to over 5,000 tools, templates, presentations, and research documents that will make your job easier every single day. SIG's website also offers a career network with postings for sourcing professionals and internship opportunities for all levels of employment. Our Student Talent Outreach program was designed to find tomorrow's supply chain professionals today, while students are still learning about the industry and just getting started on their careers. Please reach out to me or any SIG team member directly if you'd like to have any of the questions that you might have about these programs answered, or if you'd like any information about any of these programs. Here at SIG, we are super excited to announce that we have established strategic partnerships with Bureau, HFS Research, and Art of Procurement. Please reach out to a SIG team member for more information about how these partnerships will benefit you as a SIG member. We are also very excited to announce that we have partnered with New Technologies for the upcoming Impact Sourcing Summit in Uganda. For more information about this summit, please visit newtech.com. Our SIG Global Executive Summits are our semi-annual events with more than 350 decision makers in attendance. The agenda and event details for our Spring Summit in Amelia Island, Florida are available on our website, and registration is now open. I am actually speaking to you today from Amelia Island, Florida. It is beautiful, relatively warm, so we'd love to have you escape the cold and come network with us in April. Here at SIG, we are trying to gain a bit more of a global footprint, so please take a look at some of the upcoming global events on the SIG website under the Networking Events tab. And if you have any colleagues in these cities, please invite them to attend. SIG University offers training and development opportunities to people of all levels in their sourcing careers. These programs are a great way to continue learning about the industry. We are currently enrolling for the next semester of all three of our programs beginning on January 21st. For more information, please reach out to a SIG team member or visit siguniversity.org. And that brings us to the most exciting part of our time today. Our presentation today is entitled The Buck Stops Here, building a winning business case to transform P2P. Got a little tongue-tied there. With us today is Richard Waugh. He is certainly no stranger to SIG webinars, and he is a fan favorite among our speakers here. Richard is the Vice President of Corporate Development at Zycus. He has an extensive background in B2B e-commerce and helped launch GE's TPN, the first online marketplace for sourcing and procurement. He also co-founded B2E Markets, which is the first SaaS sourcing suite provider. In addition to his long list of contributions to the industry, he is also an analyst in the supply chain management market for the Aberdeen Group. And with him today is Paul Stasko. He is the Senior Director of Supply Chain Management at Curtiss-Wright. Paul Stasko has been a member in good standing of ISN Pittsburgh for 12 years now. Professionally, he has been working in supply chain for the past 13 of his 30-year career. Prior to working in supply chain, Paul held technical and management roles in operations with Westinghouse and Curtiss-Wright in Cheswick. His current title is Senior Director of Corporate Supply Chain, where his team is chartered with bringing benefits of centralized procurement through strategic sourcing to a decentralized business model. Paul holds a Bachelor's of Science in Mechanical Engineering and Technology from the University of Pittsburgh in Johnstown, as well as a BSNE from the University of Pittsburgh. So joining us today, we have two very talented and knowledgeable presenters. Gentlemen, we are thrilled to have you with us today. So without further delay, I will go ahead and turn the control over to you. Richard, please take it away.
Well, thanks so much, Destiny, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So the buck, normally the phrase goes, the buck stops here, but today the buck starts here because, we're really talking about how do you build this winning business case for P2P. And I'm so thrilled to be joined by someone who's actually done it. So far from just covering the theory, Paul's going to share with us his firsthand experience of putting together that winning business case and actually not just using it to get his initiative green-lighted, but making it a living, breathing document that really guides their progress along their flight path to success going forward. So before we jump into the content today, just a little bit of background on Zycus. So we provide an integrated suite of source-to-pay software modules. So today we'll be zeroing in, of course, on Procure-to-Pay, but within a source-to-pay suite of tools, we cover both strategic procurement, sort of the upstream phases consisting of spend analytics, sourcing, contract, and supplier management, as well as the downstream or operational procure-to-pay, which will be the focus of our discussion today. And, of course, Zycus has been recognized as a leader across this source-to-pay continuum in Forrester's e-procurement wave, a leader in Gartner's Magic Quadrant for sourcing suites as well. So the agenda. We really wanted to walk through a playbook for building this winning business case formula, and we'll take each step in turn, but really starting by scoping out the project. We'll talk about what that entails. And then first at a fairly high level, being able to articulate what are the objectives, sort of what's the vision or the end state for this project, and where do we see the value levers throughout Procure-to-Pay that are going to be the most influential ones to really leverage in that business case. And I think before embarking on this kind of endeavor, you really need to know what your current as-is state is, or what is the baseline performance. So I'll walk through a few, I think, pretty useful benchmarks to kind of compare where you are today against what represents sort of the state of the art or best in class, and find where that gap is, because that really is the opportunity for process improvement and profitability enhancement. And that's where the next step kind of comes in. Now we want to assess the benefit potential. Identify and sort of itemize by bucket where is that profit and performance improvement opportunity, and how do we quantify that? Now we also have to think about what this is going to cost when we produce the ROI. So not just in terms of an investment, let's say in technology in terms of a software license or implementation fees, but also what it's going to take from the standpoint of internal resources. So we want to inventory those internal resources, not only to assess what the costs are for allocating those resources, but also make sure that the required skill sets and competencies are available when we need them according to the timeline of the implementation. And we'll talk as the next step about how to put together that implementation plan. And in most cases when we talk about Procure-to-Pay, there are often multiple phases, especially with let's say a global enterprise like Paul represents at Curtiss-Wright. So that for most organizations, the big bang, do it once and be done, is not going to be an available option in this case. It usually will require some type of a phasing strategy that becomes part of the implementation plan. So when we bring it all together, look at both the investment that's going to be made and the timing of those cash outflows, if you will, as compared to the benefit or the inflows of cash that are going to come, and really be able to forecast an ROI for a project over a representative time horizon, let's say a 3 or a 5-year look. And having this tidy little package then, how do you go about then getting that in front of the C-suite, getting sign-off on the project, but also getting ongoing C-suite support and buy-in to drive adoption? Post-go-live, we'll talk about some strategies for identifying quick wins, putting some points on the board early to build momentum, and also not to be overlooked, really focusing on promoting and trumpeting those successes to continue to build that kind of a groundswell for the ongoing rollout and business case achievement. And I mentioned earlier how, in particular, Paul at Curtiss-Wright makes this business case not just something that's done to get the project funded and then gets put on a shelf, but how it becomes a living, breathing document to, on an ongoing basis, be able to track the achievement against key performance metrics to really determine if you're on course or course correct if for some reason something is not quite meeting the targeted forecast as well. So that's our playbook. Let's get right into it. Step one then is really scoping the project across a couple of different dimensions. What processes will be included? For instance, represented here is Hackett's model for the end-to-end purchase-to-pay process, and it's bifurcated between sort of procurement's traditional responsibilities and accounts payable responsibilities. So on the procurement side, you're really looking at, from a process standpoint, how requisitions and POs are processed and enabled, and part of that enablement and procurement responsibility is then making sure that the content that supports those processes is in place. So that means negotiating contracts, having those contracts visible or catalogs available for requisitioners, and then after the order's been placed is typically where AP picks up with the invoice processing. So oftentimes AP is typically most responsible for actually onboarding suppliers, adding them to the supplier master so that their invoice can get paid, as well as going through all the steps to receive the invoice, get it approved, do the matching process and any reconciliation, culminating then with the payment and storage and reporting on those payments as well. So throughout our discussion today, I've got the great luxury and opportunity to ask an expert. As I said, somebody who's actually done it. So Paul, when you started to look at this initial step of scoping the P2P project, how did you determine what processes would be in scope? In other words, would it include both P's of P2P, the purchase and the payable side? And depending on what you decide, what needs to be considered and who needs to be involved?
So from a Curtiss-Wright perspective, when we started out, I because I'm responsible for corporate supply chain, my focus was clearly on the first P. And as I started down the path, it's kind of serendipitous how we got both P's involved. I went to our chief information officer and requested his assistance in my evaluation. In parallel with the supply chain transformation that was going on, there was a finance transformation going on, and he introduced me to the person leading that. So it turned out to be a really critical element. I don't think we could have been successful if we would have just looked at half of this. So the vice president of finance and myself became partners joined at the hip right at that point. And we created our scoping document when we went out to suppliers to figure out who we were going to partner with, as well as the business case that we'll talk about a little bit here. But it's critical that you have both sides of this as part of it. From the integration perspective, from the mapping to the GL perspective, and from the commitment that you're making in that business case.
So one of the takeaways, I guess, Paul, might be if you're going to address the the e-procurement side, let's say purchase to order only, that may be something that procurement could accomplish essentially on their own. But if it's full P2P and it's going to include AP, the AP side of the equation, finance has to be, a co-collaborator.
Yeah, I think I would call it a partnership, actually. And even if you're only considering the first P, there's still an element there, depending on the complexity of your organization, where you need that input, because if you want to automate how charges are applied, you really need to get finance involved in mapping with you on that GL structure to taxonomy to try to make it seamless. We want to make it so that when our users go in, they really don't have to think about much, that the tool itself is automated enough that it's figuring out what budget and segment of that budget it should be charging the expenditure to.
Perfect. So clearly, whether it's full P2P or partial, or even if that's going to be staged or phased, procurement's going to need support, a partnership, especially with finance. So the next sort of decision along the scoping process here is how much spend is addressable. And traditionally, Procure-to-Pay has been focused on indirect spend, but would it include direct spend as well? How did you go about determining really how much spend was on the table for your project?
So we have a member on our supply chain council from the finance group, and we got some reporting. Our intent initially was to look at the corporate agreements that we had put in place, and we were having a real struggle in leakage on those contracts. And usually when you look at why things are leaking, one of the biggest, why spend is going around your contracts, that's what I mean by leaking. It's not typically intentional. A lot of the times it's because we didn't do a good job communicating or articulating the contract or how to access that contract. So we were looking at this tool as a means to manage a lot of that indirect spend for us. So our focus was primarily on the indirect side. However, that being said, once we got the partnership with our friends from finance, and they're looking at the automation of the settlement process, once we completely implement on the indirect side, our goal is then to take purchase orders that are actually birthed in our ERP system, transmit them through Procure-to-Pay so that we can still automate that settlement side. So when I say birthed in the ERP, that means that it's actually formed there. When we're transmitting it through technology to our suppliers, we'll pick up metadata that will allow a PO flip to actually automate the back end of this. So we're trying to take as much advantage of Procure-to-Pay for automation as possible.
Yeah, great message. Really looking at maybe as capturing as much of the total indirect spend on the requisitioning side, but also looking at some of the direct categories as well in terms of delivering the PO and enabling the settlement process, so maximizing benefits. The next consideration we want to consider here is from a scoping standpoint, for a global enterprise like Curtiss-Wright, how did you go about determining if all business units and geographies would be in scope, and if yes, how would they be prioritized?
So from a geographical standpoint, we are a global company. We determined early on that we wanted everybody to be in scope, no matter the language or currency involved. We prioritize basically, we're headquartered in the United States, the predominance of our spends in North America. So our focus initially has been on North America, and we've captured a lot of that to date. And so we're actually in 2019, that's where we're expanding into our European markets. So we look really where our biggest opportunity was as far as geographically to start. We started where the biggest opportunity was, and then we're moving through a Pareto analysis all the way through the tail spend of our other geographies. But the intent is that all geographies will be represented on the tool.
Great, and kind of the final scoping question I've got for you, Paul, is thinking in terms of users. How do you determine the potential volume of users that you're targeting, and also did you identify specific user roles that need to be part of the process?
Yeah, so the first part is in the requisitioning side, there's clearly requisitioners, buyers, and approvers are the three main roles as far as the execution side of the tool is concerned. With the requisitioners, that's the large population, clearly. We made the decision that if you have a Curtiss-Wright email address that you could potentially be you have that profile, you're a requisitioner. Now, not all were trained, and there's some locations where they don't want everybody to have that access, so we've scaled back where we need to. But the onset, anybody could have a need, and since there's the approval steps next, we felt that we were still being very prudent with the company's money by expanding that much. Now, when we did that, there were some sites where they really didn't want that, so we were able to retract back on that initial statement. But the approval role, we integrated our Procure-to-Pay solution with our HRIS system, so it knows the hierarchy of who reports to who, and we have allocations on what each is responsible for. So it's fully automated there on who approves what at what different levels. In the buyer roles, we went with our typical buyers that are in place today and just trained them in the use of this automated tool.
Great. We're off to a flying start. So we've really kind of nailed the scope. We know what processes are included, how much spend is addressable. We've got a sense of the geographies and potentially how we're going to phase. And we kind of have identified the key user population and key roles for the process. So let's move on to the next step, and we'll talk about both identifying project objectives and value levers, but project objectives first. And I think this is, at a very high level, kind of creating a vision. And in your case, Paul, I think it both encapsulates sort of a problem statement, what are we seeking to address, and a vision for how we want the desired or to-be future state to really address that and be, much more favorable. So as you look at this, where you kind of looked at the situation and said, the problem we have is 80% of the time spent only 5% of our spend, and we want to move that focus away from the tactical and transactional to become more strategic. How important do you think it is to be able to articulate this sort of a vision in terms of what your objectives are for the desired to-be state?
Yeah, this is critical. So the graphic that you're looking at on the screen right now is the strategic thinking graphic that we use at Curtiss-Wright. So the ball or the sphere on the left represents the current state, and the purple one on the right is the future state, and the arrow in between is our strategy to get there. So what we found was, I think with any organization, if you look at your spend, most organizations, if you did an ABC analysis of your spend, you would find that you're spending a lot of time in tactical procurement, and what we needed to do was to free up that tactical time so that our professional buyers could focus on where the real money is and added value. So where they were being enablers, we wanted to get them out of that process, but we also wanted to be able to save money on that spend as well, and that's where we came up with the Procure-to-Pay as the third strategy of how we were going to get to freeing up that time of the buyers to focus on strategic sourcing of where the real money was. So this was our elevator speech, and since our business case or our desire for this came at my level and not at the C-suite level, so your organizations could be different. This could be coming down from above, but we had to sell it up. So this elevator speech, or how we came up with this strategy, starting with a why. Why do we need to do this, and what will you get in return? Instead of saying, here's what we want, was critical.
Yeah, the other thing I think that would be helpful context as well, Paul, because right now we're talking about your focus on Procure-to-Pay and the business case that supports it, but in the broader context, P2P has really been a subset of more of an overall source-to-pay transformation. So maybe if you can give us a little bit of the backstory, how does P2P fit into the overall source-to-pay transformation? What are the synergies or dependencies that you see between the two?
Right. So coming out of the gate, we recognize that we have an e-sourcing module that we use as well, and we've had some really nice successes with it, but we struggle to get the adaptation to it because people just don't have the time. And really, that's what we looked at, was Procure-to-Pay, freeing up some of that tactical time so that we could create more sourcing events in our e-sourcing module to bring additional save to Curtiss-Wright. So they go hand in hand. And typically, we're looking at our sourcing, our e-sourcing strategy around our direct spend. But what we found was that there's opportunities as we try to expand our footprint in the procure-to-pay space, that we've created some indirect sourcing events that then we end up integrating into our procure-to-pay platform as a catalog, so that people can transact against it as well. So it's been a like a hand in glove type of operation for us as far as integrating these components into our overall strategy.
Terrific. So P2P is part of a broader objective around full source-to-pay transformation. But specific to P2P, we wanted to segue and talk about the value levers that a P2P automation project can help an organization to maximize or optimize. So I've got a laundry list here. This comes from Hackett Group as well. You know, that procure-to-pay initiatives can certainly help drive adoption or compliance to preferred supplier contracts. Improve a focus, sometimes this part is overlooked actually, improve a focus on demand management. So not just spend management, but demand management, because after all, having a more effective requisitioning process and requisition approval workflow on the front end can actually help defer, or let's face it, in some cases deny purchases and therefore spend before they ever happen. So demand management becoming part of it. Certainly sort of the symbiotic relationship that you just spoke to, Paul, of being able to improve strategic sourcing effectiveness, A, by freeing up more time, spending less on tactical pursuits to be more strategic, and B, to really mine the data, to use that greater spend visibility to become more effective on those strategic sourcing projects. Since we are including the AP side as part of a full procure-to-pay, being able to achieve your working capital strategies. And this one is kind of it's sort of an either-or approach. You either, if your working capital strategy is maybe to extend days payable outstanding, hang on to cash longer, the visibility and control will help you do that. Or if you want to achieve greater early payment discounts by being able to accelerate the invoice approval process, that could be an effective use of that strategy as well, driving greater rebates through purchasing card usage and just overall efficiency. So as you look at these kinds of value levers, which would you say were the priorities for your business case?
Yeah, we had three priorities in our business case. The primary and the overarching one was to drive the greater adoption to the preferred supplier contract. So it wasn't only just to get the pricing that we had previously agreed, but as we did the rationalization of those suppliers, or as we continue to do the rationalization of those suppliers, what we're seeing is the ability to go back on the renegotiation and get even deeper discounts, and in some cases growth incentives that have been negotiated. So that's been very powerful for us in meeting our objectives. The process improvement side of it, again, was part of my strategy, and that was typically to free up time so that we could get more usage in the e-sourcing module for strategic sourcing events, and we have found some of that to resonate with us. But also we've seen a slight reduction in our FTEs required to do the process. So no, we haven't taken anybody out of the organization because of the tool, but what we have been able to do is, as some of the people have attrited through retirement or other opportunities within the company, we've had less need to replace all of them because of the automation that we've seen. And ultimately, that's one of the big automation drivers in the business case on the payment side of it, right? So a lot of what's being done there is very tactical. So where we can use this tool to eliminate some of those tactics, as those folks attrit out, we can see that group getting smaller as well and driving additional savings. When it comes to the capital objectives, like Richard said, we have cycled a little bit here. Right now, we're in the extend our DPO mode, but we do see that at some point changing, where we'd want to take advantage of the fact that we're able to have that visibility now to do the early payment discounts that we've previously negotiated, when that seems to make more sense for our strategy.
Terrific. So we've kind of zeroed in on the key value levers that are going to sort of inform and drive our business case. And I mentioned step 3 then is really doing some benchmarking to understand what your current baseline performance is. And I'll just share a few key metrics here, fairly quickly. But as we look across Procure-to-Pay, Paul, you just alluded to the fact that probably your number one value lever was, really driving users to make purchases from the approved contracted vendors. So this metric then becomes really critical, understanding what percentage of your spend is currently compliant to contract. So here we can look at some benchmark data. This comes from Ardent Partners that contrasts the average performance, so all others, at about the typical organization has only slightly better than 50% of their spend that's compliant to contract. Nobody's 100%, of course, but clearly best-in-class organizations which have typically taken advantage of a full P2P automation are really driving a much higher percentage at about 71% of spend that's compliant to contract. So, in that case, if you looked at that, the spread between the two, and it's 18 or so percentage points, if you could take 18% more of your indirect spend and make it compliant to contract, that's going to be one of the huge levers in terms of your business case overall. It's also nice to kind of understand what percentage of transactions are compliant. But generally speaking, the bigger driver is going to be, how do I increase the volume of my spend that goes through the P2P system and that is therefore placed with approved contracted vendors, a compliant purchase instead of a maverick purchase, if you will. So looking at a couple of other benchmarks here, certainly we're talking about digitization and automation when it comes to P2P, taking the friction out of the process and removing those manual steps. And here, once again, this data coming from Hackett Group, pretty big disparity between what the top performers are being able to achieve across the procure-to-pay transaction cycle as compared to the peer group overall, the average performance. So just to highlight a couple of these really quickly, certainly the process starts with a requisition, goes to a PO, and results in an invoice being issued and approved and ultimately payment issued. But PO kind of being one of the key transactions here. Look how big the gap is. So 85% of PO transactions for top performers are fully digitized, electronic, meaning the requisition was entered online, was routed through an automated approval process, and not only that the PO was generated from the system, but it was disseminated electronically to the supplier. So that means using a standard protocol such as EDI or XML or through a portal interface does not include email transmissions, because after all, what we're looking at is reducing manual intervention both on the buyer side as well as the supplier side. So you want to make sure that no one has to open up that email and then enter data. You want that kind of machine-to-machine integration, and it's being achieved on the vast majority of transactions, the 85% shown here for top performers, but only a third of transactions digitized or fully electronic for the peer group overall. So again, if you've got that kind of gap, that's a big opportunity to close that gap and really drive automation throughout the process. And generating electronic PO is a great enabler then for ensuring that you can get an electronic invoice back from your supplier. So if I can send, as a top performer, 85% of my POs electronically, I'm getting nearly the same percentage, 79% back. After all, I'm enabling, for instance, a PO flip on the supplier side to be able to directly transfer all that information from the PO, including the line level information, into an invoice that's going to be much more likely to be fully accurate and enable a first pass match on the back end. And once again, the gap is as significant, where just 28% of invoices are currently received electronically for the average organization. And once again, the email with PDF attachments doesn't qualify because someone has to open that email attachment and scan it in or enter the data manually into an invoice. So just some ways to kind of set some targets for digitization across the P2P process. Another view here is the transaction quality overall. So you can look at the initial PO creation all the way through payment. And when you add it all together, the average organization is able to complete a perfect order, meaning going through each step of the procure-to-pay process without any errors 80% of the time. 98% of the time, PO creation is done in a compliant way. That simply means that a PO was not done after the fact. So 2% of the time, people are going back after an invoice has been received and saying, oh, I should have created a PO in the first place. 93% of the time, they're getting suppliers to deliver according to the promise date. 94% invoice acceptance means that on average 6% of invoices get returned to suppliers outright because they're incomplete or inaccurate. The greater percentage of accurate invoices received would certainly enable a higher first pass match rate of matching that invoice to the PO, and of course an on-time payment rate. So just another way to look at then the transaction quality, because minimizing the level of errors or rework required is going to be key to realizing the maximum efficiencies as well. Another way to measure process efficiency is simply what is the transaction cost involved here. And once again, you can kind of benchmark where you may be today against the industry overall, and clearly here there's a significant gap or disparity between the top performers and the average organization. So whereas best-in-class companies have gotten their cost per PO below $5 and the invoice processing cost below $2.25, it's a multiple of those transaction costs that the average organization is saddled with today. So opportunity on that front. I know, Paul, in your area, a key focus has been how do we maximize the volume of indirect spend that's going through catalogs, because after all, that's the most seamless, the most efficient way to manage the requisition and a PO process is to get as much spend on catalog as possible. So while it doesn't typically for most organizations address the majority of their spend, you can see that even top performers capture just about 15% of indirect spend on catalog. It does, however, from a process efficiency standpoint, represent a significant opportunity because overall, for top performers, for example, they're getting 63% of the requisition volumes on catalog-based requisitions as compared to free text, and almost a similarly significant percentage of the transactions from a line item level, 49% of the line items on catalog for the top performing organizations. So we got some benchmarks. We've identified a little bit better where the gaps are and where we need to focus. Now it's time to sort of start to quantify these things and be able to assess the benefit potential. So, Paul, we kind of have your methodology and modeled here where you look at the fact that you really want to focus on three key priority areas, procurement savings on corporate contracts, process improvement, automation, and cash management, making sure to focus on hard dollar savings only. And then you've got sort of the time horizon and the model or the metrics that are part of your parametric model. So what process did you follow to determine the scope and parameters? How did you put together your business case methodology?
Okay, so you alluded to the fact that, and you're accurately so, that I created a parametric model. And what I mean by that was, the first step in that was we put together a schedule, an onboarding schedule of what we thought we would be able to accomplish, what business units would come on and when. And so I made some assumptions about their indirect spend. I knew what their indirect spend was, but I had to make some assumptions about the percentages of that would be addressable through the tool, and a couple of other assumptions on what I considered to be their current leak rate against our contracts. So what could I expect to improve by? Sorry about that. And then what I did was I built a model that kind of laid that out just on a timeline basis. And anything that I say is an assumption, that became a parameter that was adjustable in my model. So every assumption was an adjustable parameter. Then I wanted to make one other assessment on how quickly, once somebody goes live, how quickly will they adopt to the new technology. So since we had some data about when we did our P-card implementation, I looked at from the date of a start of a business unit on a P-card to when they were fully functional, what was that ramp rate of spend through there? And I just did linear regression and said, well, if it was that for a P-card, why wouldn't it be similar for a Procure-to-Pay model? So I built that ramp rate into my model for each of the business units as they were being onboarded into the tool. And then I made one last assumption on what could we improve. There's still going to be some leakage. There's still going to be some reason for leakage around these corporate contracts, so I wanted to make some assumptions there as well. So what percentage we would start at and where we would drive it to. And then with that model, then I was able to look at over time what type of savings we could achieve. I made one other parameter in that model that I added was there's opportunity for corporate contracts that are much smaller than the larger ones that we had put in place. But the reason we couldn't go after them or didn't go after them was it would be too difficult for us to deploy. But with Procure-to-Pay, you can go after some of those that might be more focused and get it out in front of people very easily, because when they log onto the tool, they can see that it's available to them. Or when they go into the search bar, it doesn't come up with a null search. They actually can find what they're looking for, where we didn't really have that capability on some of these smaller categories that we've gone after since we've implemented Procure-to-Pay. So I had an assumption built into the model related to creating those types of catalogs as well. And what we ended up doing was we took that parametric model and we made it somewhat conservative because we wanted to hold ourselves accountable to it as the process started, as Richard alluded to in the beginning. So as we're now concluding our second year of implementation, I've been able, through the first 2 years, to look at what that model was projecting in our business case and what our actual performance has been against that model. And surprisingly, we've slipped a little bit in our implementation schedule, not anything to do with the technology, but more with trying to influence those to participate. So change is always difficult. We didn't have a mandate, so when we went into this, we have to go into each business unit and sell them on the virtues of implementing this tool. And that's why we took our original strategy on who to go after. Geographically, we looked at where the money was, but then when we got into the U.S. as being our first opportunity, we had to look at those business units within. And we didn't go after where the biggest spend was. We went after where the biggest opportunity, where the technology forerunners were, or the people that were requesting this were, versus those who resist change. And we put those who resist change, I like to refer to them as the heel draggers, at the end of the process, so that we would have those advocates for the process and the success stories already in place before we got to those that might resist change. And what we found was that we've actually gotten to the point in our implementation schedule where we have some that haven't been implemented yet. They're actually asking us, hey, what about us? When do we get in? Which is a great transformation story, and I highly recommend it. If you understand your organization well enough to know who will want to play versus those that will resist the new technology, that you kind of build that into your model as well, and that's what we did. And so it's kind of interesting. Some of those things did drag out a little bit, but we're still able to meet our model, and the reason we were able to meet it was we were finding that some of the conservatism that was built into the model was helping us overcome some of the delays that we were having with that influence piece. So now we've re-snapped that model, looking into how we're going to go to year 3. We've created a new savings target for ourselves that must be achieved And when I say achieved, I mean exceeded. So what I like to report is this is the minimum amount of return you're going to get in 2019. And from that, now we'll go forward and try to execute against it. So it's been very helpful, not only in creating a business case that I could sell to the C-suite because I could show them the parameters that we considered, and it was all encompassing. They bought into the fact that it looked like we considered everything to the extent that we could see. And then we put variables in there for the things that we were estimating, so that if we were wrong or if they wanted to challenge it, it would repaginate and show us a different picture based on changes in that model. And I have one version of it that I didn't share with them that showed a conservative case and a best case. So it has two lines on this growing savings chart where I can kind of see where do we fit in between those two lines. So I highly recommend a parametric model as you go forward. It's very, very helpful.
Extremely robust model, certainly, and I'm just kind of putting myself in the shoes of someone who may be just about embarking on this type of an initiative, and may find it a little bit daunting. So I thought it might be helpful to if you could share, Paul, what were the challenges that you faced and maybe how you overcame them and just gathering the data, baseline data for then feeding the parametric model?
Well, so some of the data that I needed was, one of the real challenges for us is we don't have true spend visibility in our corporation because we grew by acquisition. So our business systems don't talk to each other. We're on multiples of different ERP systems and count of over 32 that don't speak with each other. When we acquire companies, we keep them on their standard GLs that they were acquired under. So our GL structures are very disparate as well. So we have a commonizer or a Rosetta Stone at the finance level. So I got that top level data from them. Now in the spend data, when I had to make assumptions about leakage levels, we did have about 2/3 of our company already on the iAnalyze module or the spend visibility model of Zycus. So I could kind of make some assumptions from what I could see at those line level transactions on suppliers that were outside of the realm of the categories that we handled. And I could use that as the basis for my starting parameters that I put into that model. And then I made some conservative assumptions because I hadn't been in the procure-to-pay environment prior, so I didn't have experience from another company. My whole experience has basically been here in supply chain with Curtiss-Wright. So I had to make some assumptions about what I thought we might be able to achieve, and on a conservative basis. And then if somebody challenged me, I could quickly change that number so that we could see what that looked like. And I tried to keep it to a success metric that I knew that we could underpromise and overachieve.
Right, and then that kind of, to my final question here, did you get any pushback? I think your strategy for minimizing pushback would be to be sufficiently conservative that you can underpromise and overdeliver, right?
That's correct. And one of the biggest challenges we had came from our chief operating officer, who his statement to me was, and he claimed to be old school and didn't see technology as a solutions provider for any of our ills. And he quoted that in his history, he's always saw these technology implementations like this overrun cost and underrun performance, because he was relating that to an ERP implementation. I'm sure several people on the call have been there. They've been through ERP implementations or conversions from one ERP system to another, and they are expensive and difficult to implement. And I could see where he was coming from, but I said to him, even if that would happen here, and this is much easier than an ERP implementation, if I overran cost by 10% and underran performance by 20%, where would that leave us? When he looked at the business case, he said, yep, that would leave us very successful.
Right, a great model to look at. So we've got, a very robust projection of the benefit potential. Now we want to make sure we've got the resource cost accounted for, but also we've kind of inventoried and know that we're going to have the internal resources required to pull off this kind of initiative. So here's kind of an example of a model for estimating the internal resources, and certainly it's more than just the sort of the program management or project manager role that may be driven from procurement, but it certainly has to include multiple other functions, typically an IT project lead, representation from finance, legal, other functions as well. So as you looked at your project, how did you determine the overall program management responsibilities between procurement and finance?
So for us, what we did was we actually put in place 2 program managers, which might be a little bit unique to our implementation, but we have one from the finance side. He's not only doing program management of what they do, but he's also responsible for the overall schedule of what we're doing and the tasks in hand. He calls all of our meetings, whether they be with our internal resources alone or combined with our internal resources and the Zycus folks. So he coordinates all of that. And on my side of the ledger, we have a project manager as well, and he's really responsible for supplier adoption as well as the inputting of all the different catalogs and making sure that we've covered on all the different categories that we need to be covered on. So he really brings a breadth of responsibility and experience from the Procure-to-Pay environment from previous experience that he had prior to coming to Curtiss-Wright. So he was a new hire specifically for this project. And we've also put in place, as part of our business case, and we executed against, was an internal help desk so we can understand what the needs of our internal folks were, so they never felt like there wasn't a friendly voice or email response on the other end of the line. So anytime we get that type of a request, we actually track it and track our response time to it as well. And that was all built into our business case as things we would need. And we did execute per the business case, adding those resources to our team.
And would you say, looking back over the initial phases of the implementation, is it consumed more internal resources than you expected, fewer, or just about what you had projected?
Yeah, we're just about as expected, and we did that intentionally. We really vetted that well, and actually part of that vetting was done with experienced professionals at Zycus, so that they could tell us what a typical implementation would look like, so that we were covered when we built our business case. So it's been pretty much spot on.
Excellent. So, looking at the implementation process, here's some data from Gartner that looks across not just Zycus customers, but any P2P implementations, and there is some variability, but the average or the mean is just about 8 months. And I would say this is for the initial go live, because P2P implementations will often involve multiple phases then, especially as rolling out additional geographies and so on. But, would like for you to comment, Paul, on your phasing strategy, how long you expected it might have taken, what your actual experience was, and any best practices or lessons learned from the implementation experience.
Sure. So it's nice to see that we're pretty much on par with what was stated in this study by Gartner. We started we had our kickoff meeting in December, and we had our first transaction in August, so August 8th. So it was pretty much spot on to what I'm seeing here. That's good to know. Our implementation, I had previously mentioned, we were very careful in selecting which groups we wanted to be in a pilot. We wanted groups that we knew were early adopters, and that really paid big dividends. We also wanted to make sure that they weren't only early adopters. There was one other piece, because I don't care what technology you're implementing, there's always going to be some issues out of the gate. So we wanted a group of folks that we knew would work well through those issues and recognize that there was a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow if they helped us work through those issues. And because of that, because of that phasing strategy, we actually have developed some internal advocates at those pilots. So what we've done, too, is when we're trying to bring another business unit on and knowing who those folks are at the business units, we've actually shared their names and contact information so that they could talk to other Curtiss-Wright business unit employees who are not on our project implementation team to get their take on things. So it's really helped swing our success metrics.
Excellent. So right on target in terms of the implementation. Once you've pulled all this together, you've forecast the benefits, you've made sure that you've got the resources lined up, got an implementation plan in place, then you have to present sort of an executive summary ROI. So here's just an example. Every opportunity is going to be a little bit different depending on how big your spend is and other factors, but fairly typical to see somewhere around a 3% or so savings on a percentage basis of indirect spend, and then being able to project that as an ROI. Yours may not be quite this robust, an 18x ROI in this example over 3 years, but I think generally speaking, Procure-to-Pay is going to return the type of very measurable and attractive ROI that's going to pass muster in most cases. And in terms of passing muster, I think we're at this critical stage now, Paul, where you got all your information together, you've done your homework, but now you got to get consensus among key C-suite executives such as your CFO, the COO, CIO as represented here. So what were some of the hot button issues having been through this process, and how were you able ultimately to gain consensus amongst the C-suite?
Well, with the CIO, we had him involved in the decision-making process when we were selecting a provider to go with. So we wanted his buy-in. We didn't want to select a provider that he disagreed with and then spent most of his energy trying to prove that he was right and we were wrong. So he had a very nice voice in our selection process. But we've also been blessed when we asked him for a resource to help us with the integrations. He's gotten personally involved. So he's very intimate with our implementation and the Zycus product as a whole. So he's been critical to us. The CFO was really focused on that automation of the AP process, and all along he's been a big supporter of this. He was bought in at the early stages of the business case. The chief operating officer was the doubting Thomas in the group. He was the skeptic, but he was completely swung from a skeptic to an advocate. And it's really nice to see now that not just with the three here, but everybody on the C-suite has a positive message, because when they go into any of the business units where we've deployed, they always ask the question about, how is it functioning? They've even asked people that they didn't think would know anything about it to give them their perspective of a demo. And they were surprised how many people were so easily fluent in the tool because it's that easy to use. So it's been nice to have two of the three already involved and have the third one become an advocate as opposed to an opposition to what we were trying to accomplish. So it's been a great success. And again, I do highly recommend that your CIO be involved in your decision-making process so that he or she is intimate with the selection criteria and has a voice in that.
Yeah, that's great. And I think building consensus, not just amongst the C-suite, but across the organization, often means effectively promoting the project, identifying quick wins, promoting successes. We've kind of shown your version of the elevator speech here, but maybe just comment briefly on kind of what best practices, maybe in addition to the elevator speech, you use to help promote the initiative internally.
So we're a little bit unique. Again, we're decentralized, but we run with a corporate supply chain council, of which I lead. And that council from each of our divisions has the highest ranking supply chain person represent the interest of that vice president on my council. And we had them involved initially when we were looking at Procure-to-Pay as a solution to help us here. So we were all aligned as a group, and they went out to be the advocates within their divisions. So as we try to implement within each of the divisions, we've already had these folks aligned. They're embedded in there so that it's not like corporate is coming in and saying this is what you should do. There's an internal person that's already been a part of that process as well, and he or she is advocating on behalf of this solution as well. So we found that to be incredibly helpful as we try to penetrate. We've never started with here's what it is. We've always started with here's why we're doing it. So starting with why, what are we trying to solve? What is the problem? How are we going to make it better for them? What's in it for them? Has been a big plus in getting engagement with our stakeholders at the business units.
Awesome. And finally, Paul, we mentioned that you've made your business case a living, breathing document. So post go live, continuing to monitor performance and track some key performance metrics. I think I've listed pretty faithfully your key metrics here. Why are these the ones that you're tracking? And how have they helped you course correct as you go through the process?
Well, every one that we're tracking right now we're in our original business case, and annually I'm held accountable to meeting that business case. So the business case wasn't just an approval to get funding. It was also an accountability document for me, and it will be for a period of 5 years. That's what we projected out through the business case. So I've used it to help when we're missing somewhere else. Our executives have been fine as long as we hit the overall number by adopting or exceeding in one other area, and then the overall bottom line number that we committed to for a year has been met or exceeded. So it's been our guiding light as to how we're going to course correct as we go forward. And then we take that model that we used to help create it, and we just put a little tweaks into what reality is, and we can reproject that number. And when we see there's a shortfall, we have other knobs we can see that there are those variables, those parameters in there that we can turn up to try to get to where we need to be.
Well, this is terrific. Yeah, Paul, I know we could go on probably all afternoon because this is such a fertile sort of topic, and you've got so much in-depth knowledge and firsthand experience. But I know, Destiny, we're up against the hour, so I want to thank you, Paul, and invite folks to follow up with any detailed questions that they may have that could be addressed either by Paul or myself.
Yes, thank you both, gentlemen. This has been an extremely insightful and informative presentation. I am actually passing out these slides right now. You can find those slides there on your screen. If you click on the link that will be uploaded into that little box that just popped up on your screen, you can download the presentation straight to your desktop. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. Of course, thank you to the Zycus team for hosting a webinar with SIG. We hope that you will all join us for the next webinar on December 11th. And please do be on the lookout for the follow-up email that will be sent out tomorrow. It will include a link to the PDF copy of the slides that you're downloading right now, as well as a link to the recorded session. So thank you again for presenting, and thank you all for joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of your day.